Now that the Indians are defeated, we'll build our own roads, thank you very much. We'll control our own schools. You stay out of our face. No business of the governor or the judges coming in and telling us what our boundaries are, or how we should deal with people we don't like, or what religious principles should be practiced. That's the business of local government. And guys like Worthington said, that's what the American Revolution was all about. Freedom, liberty, letting people decide for themselves. Now, of course, Worthington meant white men like him deciding for everybody else. But the principle was local control and low taxes. This makes Sinclair terribly unpopular, because Sinclair continues to argue, look, you can't trust people to govern themselves. And Worthington and company said, what the hell do you mean you can't trust people to govern themselves? What was this revolution in this country all about if it was not about the idea that people need to be trusted? Of course people are going to make mistakes. Of course they're impetuous. Of course they're impulsive. Of course they're going to do things they're going to have to change later. But that's democracy, dudes. Get over it. Sinclair and company don't understand this. On the national level, the representative of this populist movement is what we call a man by the name of Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian who was terribly opposed to a British-style government in the United States, who resented all of this control. Yes, he wanted to defeat the Indians. Yes, he wanted infrastructure. Yes, he wanted education. Of course he did. Jefferson was the most eloquent spokesman for education in the late 18th century. But he wanted local individuals to do it by themselves, not have it dictated by the national government. So if you're looking again at my spectrum, and you're saying, what's the role of government in development? Sinclair and company are way over here in terms of lots of government, lots of direction and control. Jefferson and his pals are over here, almost nothing. Jefferson's most famous line was, that government governs best, which governs least. In other words, stay out of our face. Now, most Americans are in the middle, as then as now. And they're making up their mind on individual issues, whatever's happening in their local area or whatever it might be. But you have these two kind of stark positions. What we associate with the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, and the Jeffersonian Republican Party, or the, quote, Democratic Party, which Jefferson founds, and which eventually drops the rest of the names and becomes known simply as the Democratic Party, the oldest permanent existing political party in the Western world, succeeded by Democrats throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. Now, you're all going to say, hey, wait a minute, the Democratic Party is not the party of least government today. You're right. That changes in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, Democratic Party was the party of white men. It was the party of white men who argued basically they should be left alone to govern themselves. So when Jefferson becomes president in 1801, winning a national victory, he then tends to favor guys like this in the Northwest Territory who demand that Sinclair and company be tossed out. And Jefferson fires Sinclair. And when he fires Sinclair, he also allows local people in Ohio to get together and say, okay, you don't like the Northwest Ordinance? Fine. Come up with your own government. And so from all over the young territory, the Northwest Territory, they come to Chillicothe, and principally to this house out here, to decide what kind of government that is that they want. You should know Sinclair fights a delaying action. One of his attempts to do is to say that they're going to divide the Northwest Territory into different states. There have to be at least 3 states. So what Sinclair wants to do is he wants to draw the line for the new state of what will become Ohio at the mouth of the Little Miami River all the way up to Lake Erie, rather than where it is actually drawn from the mouth of the Great Miami River. Now, why would he want to draw it on the Little Miami River? Anybody know? Yeah?
Well, they wouldn't have enough population.
Because they wouldn't have what? Cincinnati would be in Indiana.
Yeah.
Right. And they wouldn't have had 60,000 people. And Sinclair does that quite deliberately to try and delay that. The Congress is now Jeffersonian. Congress has all the power under the Northwest Ordinance, and Congress says, no, we'll draw the line from the mouth of the Great Miami River all the way north. Thus, Cincinnati is in Ohio, and you have 60,000 people, and you can go ahead. So in December of 1802, then, these men gathered down here in Chillicothe, which is the center of Virginia settlement, and men like Worthington and Tiven. And what do? They set up a government that is almost the opposite of the Northwest Ordinance. They say, you shall have a government elected by the people. The very first beginning, we the people, and then says, people shall be elected. You're going to have a governor. You're going to have a legislature with a House and a Senate. And you're going to have judges. You have the same basic formula, but not with the same powers or the same privileges. Every white male who is 21 years old can vote in Ohio. Now, by our standards, that's absurd. You are excluding all women. You are excluding all people of color. But by the standards of the 18th century, that was huge. Anybody who was 21 years old, who was white and male, could vote. Members of the House of the General Assembly, the representatives, are going to be chosen every year. We don't do that anymore. But they're going to be chosen every year. Why? So that they can be directly responsible to the people on a regular basis. Every year, your representative would have to come back and get reelected. The senators in Ohio will be elected every 2 years. So they've got a little bit more leeway, like the Senate in the United States government, but not a lot. They're young men. You only have to be 21 to be a representative in Ohio, and 30 to be a senator. This assembly, then, of the House and the Senate, is made up of local men of prominence. And they have total control of their own proceedings, still today, in many ways. The General Assembly of the state of Ohio under the Constitution of 1803, the General Assembly itself decides when it comes into session and when it goes out of session. No more Sinclair saying, I don't want you here, get out. The Senate and the House have to keep a journal. They have to publish a record. Why? So that anybody can see what they're talking about. They have to keep their doors open, sunshine laws in the 20th century, so that people can come in and see exactly what they are up to. It says, the Constitution of Ohio says, that any two members of the Assembly have the right to dissent and protest against any legislation they wish to protest. They have the right to do that. The House, the General Assembly, will decide who is disorderly in their body and how to punish them. Not the governor, not anybody else, because they should have that power itself. They instituted the rule that every bill introduced in the General Assembly must be read 3 times. And you guys, probably any of you who follow the government today, know this gets very frustrating to people today, because you have to read the law once, and then you have the second reading and the third reading. Why? Well, they did that because in the early 19th century, they wanted to make sure that the people, white men, were involved in government. And you read it and published it so that guys from all over the state could read it, and if they didn't like it, they had time to get to Columbus and say, don't do this. Now today, with the internet and everything else, that's probably not as necessary, but in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, that was the whole point. The governor had no veto power. The governor could not declare laws of the General Assembly invalid. None. Not at all. Now today, the governor of Ohio does have a veto power. But in the early 19th century, he did not. And this is a direct reaction against Sinclair. So what the Ohio Constitution does in establishing the General Assembly is to say, we're going to do everything we can to make local control in the government. The really powerful part of government is going to be the assembly, the legislature. And they're going to be elected regularly, and they're going to be open, and they're going to discuss things in ways that people can actually know about. The second part of government, the executive, ain't going to be like a king in our state. No, not at all. The governor will be elected every 2 years. The governor can do the kinds of things that governors normally do. That is, he can pardon people and so on. But really, the governor of Ohio had virtually no other power throughout the 19th century. He could not veto legislation. He could not call the legislature into session. He could not declare somebody behaving in a bad way or anything else. He simply had to do pretty much what the General Assembly wanted to do. He was a figurehead. And he was a figurehead by design, because he was not a king, and he was not Arthur Sinclair.